Hi, I'm Scott Anderson. Done a lot of game stuff. Probably a lot of people know me as the developer of Shadow Physics. This talk is not about Shadow Physics at all, though, or anything I do work-related. It's fun with signed distance fields. So in GDC 2010, I gave a micro talk at IGS. It was called Using Technology for Gameplay Innovation. And it was a 5-minute talk, so it was very high level, and it was kind of just like, these are things that are inspirations to me. I'd like to see more people use these type of technologies or use technology in this way to make video games. And when Andy invited me to speak here, it was like, maybe I could talk about some of this stuff more in depth. There were, in the original GDC micro talk, I had 3 inspirations. The first one was the demo scene. Woo! So obviously at least one person's familiar with the demo scene. But the demo scene is they're basically a bunch of like hardcore artists and programmers that build these real-time, non-interactive graphics demos of graphics and music that are really cool and recently have been pushing graphics hardware in ways that games haven't been. Also the creative coding scene, which woo! Obviously one person's familiar with that too. Which I mean, creative coding is kind of is what it seems like it'd be. It's people using code in very expressive ways. You treat kind of code as your paintbrush, or as your tool to build art, rather than as a tool to build tools to build art, which is a lot of the way we look at games, both in indie games and in AAA games. And the last one was molecular gastronomy, which was an interesting, one. But molecular gastronomy is basically doing these kind of cutting edge things with food. So using like liquid nitrogen to freeze food and kind of playing with your expectations and deconstructing food in interesting ways. And I thought that was kind of a cool way to look at game design, where you basically take familiar games and build them in unfamiliar contexts. And it's kind of what I was trying to do with Shadow Physics, and I feel like Fez does a really good job of doing that also. I specifically talked about 2 technologies. The first one was GPU particle systems, and I referenced a specific demo called Agenda Circling Forth, where the whole demo was rendered with particles, but there's like animated worlds and animated characters because it has millions and millions of particles on the screen. And the second one was signed distance fields, which the focus of the talk is going to be mostly signed distance fields. And I'll get to explaining what a signed distance field is in a minute. But here's Agenda Circling Forth. It's about 5 minutes. I was playing it before the talk. Since we have limited time, I'm just going to show the intro of it, just so you get an idea. Yeah. Just so you're going to get an idea of and a feel for what it is. So everything you see here is particles. You see everything is particles. And it's an interesting way of rendering things and building anything. Because everything's dynamic. Everything's fluid. Everything's animated. Everything's cut it off there. That gives you a good idea of what the possibilities are there. And this is a demo called Quite by ZOXS, which uses sign distance fields, raycasting of sign distance fields specifically. And it's also, as you see, it's very fractal, purely dynamic type world. But it's obviously much more solid than looking at particles. So everything you see here is also procedurally generated through math functions, including all the geometry materials. So yeah, you can check out both of those demos. I'll have, at the end of the slides, I'll have basically a list of references that you can look at. But, so what exactly is a distance field? Distance field is simply the closest distance to a given surface. So the distance to the surface of a sphere, the distance of the surface to a cube, the distance of the surface to a mesh. It looks something like this in the case of font rendering. It's actually very useful for font rendering as well. So basically, away from the surface, outside of the surface, it's positive, and then inside of the surface, it's negative. It's a negative value. And it can be signed or unsigned. So in the case of unsigned distance fields, you simply have the distance and you don't have the negative distance. And they can be used to represent 2D or 3D shapes. So there's two ways to create distance fields. One way is explicitly. Basically, you can generate it from a bitmap or a mesh, and you can store it in an image or a like 3D texture. So basically the difference between the mesh itself or the image itself versus the sign distance field representation of it is at every single pixel or voxel you have a distance from the surface stored. Or you can do it implicitly. Just basically use math, use a distance function that represents the distance from a given point in space, which is awesome for procedural generation. So this is an example of the distance functions for a sphere. So the input is whatever your point in space is, and it's just the length of that point from the origin minus the radius of the sphere. It's also very easy to do like CSG type composition of distance fields. For example, if you want to combine two shapes into one shape, you just find the minimum distance between the two different shapes' distance functions. And you could combine, infinite shapes with that. They can be transformed, animated and transformed in real time, as you saw in that video. So you can do, you can do basic like 3D transforms like rotations and translations, but you can also do warping of shapes and like turbulence and noise functions and things that wouldn't be easy to do on a mesh representation. So actually drawing sign distance fields in 2D. For each pixel on the screen, you basically just calculate the distance function, and if it's less than 0, you fill the pixel. Otherwise, don't do anything. Pretty simple. You can modify it to get a variety of different effects. Valve has a paper, which I'll have in my notes, where they use it for font rendering, and you can do like outlines and drop shadows and decay and all these other effects on your text easily.
3D is a little bit harder to do. A standard raycast is expensive, and you're bound to like skip details. But because it's a distance field, we can use sphere tracing, which the concept of sphere tracing is basically you still have arrays, you're still casting an array out into space, but you can skip distance. So you can calculate the nearest point to the point that you're tracing from, and then move along the array by that distance, because you're not guaranteed to have a closer point than that. And you can keep doing it until you converge and actually find something inside of the surface. So this is a graphical example of that. Here's what the algorithm looks like. For every pixel, you calculate a ray out to the far plane, set the point to the origin for max iterations, which is probably around like 16 to 64, depending on how detailed you want your raycast to be. If your distance is within the point, just fill the pixel as before and exit the loop. Otherwise, move the ray forward. See, in both 2D and 3D, you can get surface normals. You can calculate surface normals of the distance field by figuring out the gradient at the intersection point. And this is an example of the gradient. So basically, you find the distance between. You sample the distance at 2 points with a slight epsilon, which is just, epsilon is just a very, very small number, like 0.001 or something. For shadows, you can trace another ray from the intersection point to the light position. There's also other cool things you can do, like ambient occlusion is easy to do just by sampling a couple rays like near the intersection point. You can actually play around with this right now. So a lot of this is inspired by one particular demo scene coder named Ignio Quiles, and his website is iquiles.org, and he has this WebGL app called Shader Toy, and there's a bunch of shaders like the GLSL shaders that do sign distance field rendering. It's completely procedural. It's completely implicit. And also I sent out some processing code that does the 2D rendering case. Earlier, I think it was linked on the website, so you can play around with that too. For collision detection with sign distance fields, basically for simple sphere collision, you can you get the distance at the object's point using the distance function as before, and then if the distance is within the object's radius, you calculate the gradient and push the object down. If it's not within the object's radius, you don't have a collision. Very simple. This is an example of using it for a particle system because, as you see, it's relatively cheap. It works well for things like fluids and stuff where you have lots of small, fast-moving spherical objects and need to calculate collisions for them quickly. So sphere tracing is fun. It's relatively easy. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require much code to do, but everything's being done in a pixel shader, and you're potentially running lots and lots of instructions in the shader. So with more detailed scenes, it's likely to fall apart. You can also rasterize meshes to distance fields. So if you had a triangle mesh that was modeled in Maya or Max or something like that, you can actually render it to a distance field. So that's another more advanced thing. But you can also do the opposite, which is generate triangle meshes from signed distance fields, which is great for fluids because you can represent fluids as particles, and particles with a specific radius, rasterize them to a distance field, which would just be like a 3D texture or something, and then generate a triangle mesh from that, and then render that triangle mesh. There's a talk this past GDC by Matt Svoboda, which is located here, that covers all this. It's like it's very advanced stuff. It's a pretty like low level DirectX 11 shader talk, but it's good stuff if you're into that. So like I said, I have references. These aren't up right now, but I'll put them up, I guess, after the talk, where I have links to all my references, and you can read up on this stuff and check it out. That's it.
You want to pull up a chair?
Yeah.
I guess my first question is going to be how this all relates to gameplay, right? Because essentially, I mean, I'm as interested in technology as you are, I think.
Yeah.
But it's like I'm always wondering, because I've been like wandering out of the SIGGRAPH community, which is the graphics research community, where graphics is done for the sake of doing rendering and not necessarily for a specific task, right? But clearly we're here talking about games, and you're kind of like an engineer designer. So what's your take on that? Like, how does it function, and now what do you do with it? Like, how does it concern design?
I mean, that's a good question. So the reason why I'm interested in signing distance fields rather than like sitting here talking about real-time global illumination or something else that's interesting from a pure perspective, but not necessarily interesting from like a gameplay perspective, is I think there's a lot of value in different types of world representations. I mean, generally speaking, in games we represent worlds as either pixels or polygons. That's it. So I think there's a lot of value in it. You know, even if you look at Minecraft, for example, it's kind of like a box of grid type, like a very, very coarse box of grid type world representation. It gives you a lot of interesting influences of the world as well. So yeah, that's why I think.
So you actually have made games?
No, I have not. I plan. No, as far as I know, no one has. And people are talking about it. Obviously, Max Svoboda's talk. Reagan Burns gave a micro talk at this year's GDC that covered side distance field also. He kind of said he hasn't been game with me either, but he kind of said like, yeah, there's something cool here. So, and actually, there's one example of a relatively high-profile game that uses side distance fields heavily, and that's Pixel Junction, which. One of the talks I referenced is by Jamin Kessler, who's the programmer, I guess, of Pixel Junction, and all the collision in the game, all the rendering of the dynamic geometry, fluids and stuff is all done through science. Yeah, into.
So it has been used.
Yeah, it has been used.
I mean, I know what it's good for. Yeah. You've alluded to it. It's simpler for collision detection. It's not simpler, it's like it's significantly harder for rendering.
I don't know about significantly, but performant rendering.
So you have to be clear on the fact that this demo you showed with the fractal, is that raycast or is it?
Yeah, it's all raycast.
That's not converted to mesh?
As far as I know, it's raycast.
So that's not real time?
Yeah, it's real time. Yeah.
Because I mean, you mentioned like so these depends on the resolution, but you mentioned things like rasterize. So rasterizing the particle system to 3D and then conversion to take that implicit function and move it back to a mesh. That's not, I mean, I know that's something you can do in build, but not really at a high resolution. And plus, what's the point? What's the point if you're going to render it as a mesh anyway? But anyway, it's kind of getting off the point. My point still remains that I'd be interested in, because I see that you're using a different representation that constrains you in maybe a creative way.
Yeah.
If you have something, it's like, oh, I can't, it's not just a mesh, I can't just move vertices. Right? Suddenly you have to think in a different way. That different mode of thinking might actually lead you to an entirely different insight.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know that we've talked to Scott for years. I know that you always talk about this idea of making things like fighting was like a team fighter game, but where all the fighters are just parts. You started
I think there was a fighting game like that called Balls. Remember that?
This is a little bit different.
All right. All right.
No, I know what you're talking about, but it's a little bit different. But, no, I'm not saying that. Thanks for calling me out.
So the other thing is, like, Scott and I are both judges. But this year we were both in the jury for the technical award at the IGF, the Games Festival. And you know, what happens there is you get a whole group of games, like about 25 games, that come through the first stage of people voting on them. And then basically we sit together, or we're on an email thread or on Skype, we're talking about these things all the time. We're trying to figure out what it means to give a technical excellence award at an independent games festival. And we always come up with the idea that it means creative use of technology.
Yeah.
It's a creative use.
I mean, and not everyone agrees with that.
Yeah, so my question then is, like, what does that mean? Like, how do you detect that? Like, you see something and then you know it? Like, how do you know when something is, like, how do you feel about creative use of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a kind of, you know, evolution. It's yeah, a little bit.
The use of technology is like one. Very good.
It's game design. It's a little bit. I mean, it is kind of a fuzzy line where, you know, a lot of times, like, someone could this game be made without in the case of Shadow, for instance, Shadow is that's the core of the game. Could Fez be made? Trixels, maybe, but probably not.
Does everyone know what this is? Trixels, Fez? It's a little bit like Minecraft.
Yeah, it's a little bit
like Minecraft, only that you always see the cubes or frogs in it from one of the four directions. You never see it off the walls. In Fez, you always see the world and rotate it by 90 degrees. So because if I take a cube and always just snap at the cube at 90 degrees, and then it has a texture on each side of the cubes where each texel and the texture maps exactly to one of the
So I mean, I guess you could handle 2D levels that effectively have the same representation as all four sides of the level. So you also don't have, like, in Fez, you can see things in the background, you know, you can rotate them.
But yeah, I mean, so the conversation is always very complex in this group because different people have a different definition of what it means to use technology. Traditionally, like the programmers now, I'm assuming that some of you are programmers, I guess I'm one too, is that you're so in love with technology that you kind of like don't see what it is you're actually trying to do. So people on the jury will say things like, oh wow, this is really hard technology, and that's the thing. That's the part of it. So I was on the side of, that's why I'm pushing so hard on this issue, I was on the side of the fact that it's kind of irrelevant. It's like the elegance, like if you can code something in 3 lines, it does something absolutely amazing, and that's creative use of technology.
No, I mean, I strongly agree with that. It's not like, it's not purely the difficulty of the implementation, it's the use of the implementation. Honestly, it's just a small component is better than a complicated hacking roundabout.
You've worked for companies, you've worked for larger studios, so you know what that's like. I mean, how do you guys go about it when you're working on a large game? you still try to use the simplest solution, or does the code just go out of proportion to a flat mess?
Yeah, I'd say in AAA stuff, it's like we always attempt to use the simplest solution. But different people have different ideas about that, and a lot of the time, a lot of the time when, but a lot of the time the simplest solution is the best solution. I mean, this is true in engineering in general. It's not just developers. It's web app development, writing code for kernels or whatever. Where like the simplest solution that does what you want it to do is always the best solution. And you know, any over-engineered solution, there's the whole rule of break anything break just implement it, basically.
Right. So then, but then you show us this beautiful demo where everything is particles. Right? It's not like half of it is a platform or something like that. It's not like just layered on top of something. It's like make away with everything we know,
Yeah.
and suddenly use something that's entirely different.
Yeah. And in my mind, that's very helpful. It's very helpful.
It's also very hard to do. I mean, it's hard. you haven't made the game. And,
no, it's like, yeah. I mean, he doesn't. If you go to that was the same guy. The programmer for that demo was Ben Spoyle, who also did the talk about slant distance feeds. So if you go to his website and rent the video, he has a breakdown of how they built that system and how they built the demo. And yeah, it's not simple stuff, but it's probably about as simple as it needs to be. A lot of it is getting around hardware constraints though, and pushing hardware. You have to do these kind of strange things that get hardware that's a little bit different. But at the same time, it's probably about as simple as
it's interesting because the people in the so that's a demo scene.
Yeah.
So the people in the demo scene, how are they comprised? They're usually teams, right?
Yeah.
It's not like a person who's the graphic designer and the coder.
Yeah. They're usually teams. For things like, it's interesting because for things like, so the demo scene kind of has these different types of productions. There's full-on demos, which tend to be closer to small game teams, where they have artists build assets, and then they also have programmers building and they have musicians and stuff. But there's also this whole idea of like 4K intros and 64K intros, which are extremely small but impressive graphical demos. And a lot of the time those are handled by also programmers because you don't have room for assets. Like everything has to be procedurally generated. And there are like tools that exist and stuff, usually custom and in-house, where artists can go in and do graphic networks and stuff and generate procedural meshes and procedural textures. But a lot of times it's just coders writing shaders.
Well, it's very different from the creative program. The creative program scene is more, it always feels to me that it's more generalist nature, where there's again, like a design.
Yeah.
Where there's one person who knows enough about the programming environment who also has the visual inspiration.
And the demo scene is a mix of that.
So that's interesting. So the demo scene is kind of more like the traditional AAA space, and the creative coder is more like the game.
Yeah.
Is that what you?
Yeah, I mean, once again, like different indie developers have different processes and different team sizes.
That's true. I mean, the thing is, so we talked about this a while ago. It's interesting to think about how that developed in the use, how the use of technology developed. Because if you look at the indie scene between '99 and 2005 or something like that, it was usually like the awe-inspiring part was that they show you a game that essentially looked like a AAA game, but it was done by a dude or two. Right? And then it got an award for like being amazing because it was done by two people. And then, I mean, for me, the watershed moment was Dish. The 2005 when Edmund McMillan is King of Electronic Logic, I think.
Yeah.
They won the grand prize for this use of a little physics blob that was essentially a platformer. So it didn't like throw away all the video game conventions. It took most of them, but replaced the protagonist with something that we hadn't really seen before. And that's the moment when I saw it. I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. This is a really interesting space to be in. That's what moved me into that direction.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to these things? Because it felt like that was a really interesting use of a small mastering system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if like Gish in particular was that moment for me. I don't know if I really had that moment. I'd say for me, like even though I'd seen Gish, I didn't really start to think about games in that way until Braid probably. like when I saw like the early alpha stuff, like that when it came out, but yeah, that is a turning point. It's interesting to think like why did that happen.
Well, Edmund is also, so it's interesting because it's also interesting because Edmund is not a programmer. Edmund Millen, who's the lead designer on Dish, is not, I don't think he codes. Right? So it's again like that,
Yeah.
that traditional.
Well, I mean, Alice
system.
Evans had a large hand, so
In the design?
yeah,
He's the
pretty sure it's Alice.
Because I see more and more people, like, even like our own friend, like Nero Corbetta, who suddenly decided that he doesn't want to rely on a programmer and teaches himself how to do something in XNA. And lo and behold, 1 year later, he makes Helpra and everyone loves it.
Yeah.
And he coded it himself.
Yeah.
He did all the graphic design, he did all the code himself. I find that's the more interesting. That's the interesting part of it.
The opposite of me, where I decided on my
Well, it'd be interesting to see what you actually make out of your project.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand off, but now, like, I think we should. The two things we should still talk about is, well, first of all, you are a traditional programmer, and you make tools as well. You said it's interesting to think of code as the tool, and not the tool for making the tool.
Yeah.
Right, but you have a lot of experience with code as the tool for making the tool, which the designer friend makes the game, and I'm not entirely mistaken. I think that's kind of how shadow physics happens.
Yeah. It's interesting because actually shadow physics didn't really start that way. And that's kind of just out of necessity. But then it kind of evolved.
So the history is that Steve Swink had the idea, you had the tech for it. You actually don't even know how that would be. The origins of it.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the concept. Yeah, it's a pretty good idea. So, 2 years later, actually.
That was your reaction? Yeah, that was a pretty good idea.
Yeah, pretty much. Basically.
Enthusiasm. It's amazing.
Basically, and I actually like came up with how I would implement it, which is pretty close to what you look at the implementation at that moment. It took me about 2 years.
Right, it didn't
to actually sit down.
Yeah, you coded it. It didn't have a tool set.
It didn't have a tool set.
It wasn't a tool set.
And then the tool set was added.
Well, so for all of you who don't know this, shadow physics is on indefinite hiatus. And it's not going to see. We don't know.
Yeah, it's
one of these days, maybe you'll grace us with a demo.
Yeah.
You can all download for free or for a nominal sum that will probably all gladly pay you to play some of that. So what's interesting for me is everyone who saw that first video from the Sense of Wonder Night in 2000, was it?
The first video was GDC.
Right. So that was not the Sense of Wonder Night.
Sense of Wonder Night happened. It was 2009 also.
Okay, because that video had that whole idea of like there's this little shadow dude who pushes the shadow of a ball and then it moves the 3D ball down. Right? And I remember that the guy who was interviewing you was sort of like, whoa dude, that's tight. Whoa dude, that's tight. It was just like, because everyone, that's like that moment, right? It's like the point example. I saw that and I knew that that's amazing. That's an amazingly creative use of tech.
Yeah.
Right, so it's kind of, so of course now it's sad to know that something that started off so interesting through the use of technology that wasn't possible just as like a game concept, like something running around on a platform.
Yeah.
That didn't come together.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a shame, but at the same time, like these things are very like cutting edge and experimental. I mean, that's the definition of innovation. You know, you're taking a risk, and you know it may not shift. You know it may not work as a main concept. You kind of have to do it as an exploration. You have to look at it as an exploration. It's prototyping. It's like injecting ideas because some of those ideas, a lot of those ideas will fail as awesome as they sound or look or whatever. In other situations, those.
Well, I teach this to students, so I always feel a little bit bad about chasing them down this potentially disastrous dead-end path. But at the same time, it's the only thing that fascinates, or it's not the only thing, it's the thing that fascinates me about games.
Yeah.
You actually have this kind of experience in games, which is something that obviously a studio that relies on money is not going to be as flexible in doing. right? You probably couldn't have pitched shadow physics to a company, to a larger company, and like, yeah, let's do that. Although it did happen, right? It was like, what was that other game, Lost in Shadow?
Yeah, Lost in Shadow came out.
I remember when you called it Attack of the Clones. It was another, just like, was that a Nintendo game?
No, it was less than. It came out on Wii though. They were quite, I mean, Afrochrome 2. And
You inspired.
there's a new one, Projects something.
Well, I remember before Braid came out, it was like they showed it
Project
demo,
Contrast.
they showed it demo like 3 years before it came out, and in the span between, like there were like so many games that just ripped off the concept. I was like, oh yeah, it's like Braid came out, like oh that already existed.
I mean, the thing is, like, Braid is kind of triggered this renaissance on puzzle platforms.
I'll go there.
And you know I had to. It's like a lot of people. I mean, this is true of any game, right? So you kind of have like there's this whole theory of like genre games, right? Call of Duty, WoW, Braid is the genre game, puzzle platforms. So people are like, oh yeah, I have to do this game that's basically Mario with a gimmick layered on top of it. The gimmick has to be somewhat unique, but they don't pay attention to all the other things that are going on.
The fact that you call it gimmick,
Yeah, instead of mechanic.
Mechanic, gimmick, whatever.
So I was a big fan of it. I think Braid did amazing as well.
Yeah.
Because it used an idea, it used it in a multitude of ways
Yeah.
without ever overstating its welcome of any way that it used.
No, and I feel like and there are puzzle platformers that have taken those lessons from Braid and games, that are very different from Braid, but still take the lessons from Braid. But a lot of games are just like,
It's like punk rock. Like shooters have subtle differences. Like punk rock has subtle differences. Like puzzle platforms have subtle differences. But if you look at it from a distance and you don't appreciate the genre, it's going to be a big globular mystery.
yeah. Well, I think a lot of people think like just coming up with the mechanic or the gimmick or whatever you want to call it is like what makes the puzzle platform difficult. It's a lot
So
of
I take it you don't like punk rock.
No, I like punk rock.
Okay, I think that's enough from me. Okay, I think we've had a good conversation. Oh wow, we're not done yet because I am going to try to transition this rather ungracefully into the audience. Hopefully we get some interesting questions for us.
Ask anything.
What do you see Kickstarter funding projects that may use your engine?
Well,
Due to the success of like Double Fine Adventure and Wasteland 2.
I don't know. Kickstarter is an interesting thing. I've always it's funny because before Shadow Physics had funding, I actually set up a Kickstarter for it, which I never put up because we got funding. But back then, this is 2010-ish. I was like, no, there's no way I could ever raise more than like 10K on Kickstarter or 5K or something. But the community, it was early. Like you needed invites basically to get on Kickstarter period, so that was probably true then. But now, like especially after Double Fine, the community has exploded. Things are huge. There's all kinds of crazy projects coming out of the woodwork now. It's great. So let's just say it's something I would consider. Like have no plans to do it anytime soon.
How do you feel about the difference between like digital games and tabletop games on Kickstarter? And that's like I talked to Zach Gage about this, and he was like, it's kind of strange that someone would need money to make a video game. He was like, you don't have to make the physical things; you just do it. That's Zach's take on it.
Some of us need to pay rent.
Yeah. I mean, that would be my answer. It's not even that. It's like
Zach makes games in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
Wildly successful.
yeah, I mean, you can do like smaller stuff, like grabbing and kind of stuff, and have another job. But like, I built most of Shadow Physics in part time. It's like having other jobs and full-time jobs at game studios, and it was rough. It's like I'm surprised I could drum up that much motivation. It can, as you know, it can be hard to get motivated to do stuff when you have another job or multiple other jobs and obligations. So a lot of it's just time. You're basically the reason why you want to have people probably ask, oh yeah, why do you need like 100K 2 guys working on a game before you do it for cheaper, but it's like, it's time. I want to dedicate all my time to this game, and once again, I have to pay rent. I enjoy some of the finer things in life also on top of that.
Also,
So-
you gotta pay some of the rewards.
Yeah, you have to. If you do actually do physical rewards, I don't know if you guys have read about the Star Command Kickstarter. It was a successful Kickstarter and raised I think $30,000 or $40,000. But then they had to print T-shirts from this one. They didn't really take into account T-shirt costs. So that actually took a big chunk out of their budget, a couple $1,000s out of their budget. So, yeah, you have to consider any kind of physical rewards. Like if you're printing physical copies or manuals or T-shirts or whatever, those come out of the Kickstarter as well. And plus that money gets taxed. Everybody else?
So I'm looking at the process of the example, which is super cool. But two things. 320 by 240. Is that because Java is just not fast enough to execute? This supposed to be like something where you do a larger scene?
Yeah, you could do a larger scene. If you've done it on the G, if you've done it in C++, it'd probably be better. I don't know how much better it would
So you
be.
have to go down.
And then you could do like optimized SSE code and then make it that much more better, and then you can do it on the GPU and do pretty crazy stuff. It's interesting because I was thinking about for actual games, the way I'd probably want to do it is like had effectively 2 copies of the world where the collision and the physics stuff is done on the CPU, because you don't have to do that many distance functions, so you don't have to do like 1,000 and then do all the rendering on the CPU or on GPU as a shader, and that would probably work out. But yeah, that's why it's small. Like if you can increase the size,
I did,
and it starts to chug a little
Yeah.
bit.
I don't quite get it either. I'm gonna like I understand the basic principle behind it, but looking at the code, I'm not sure exactly. Like I'm like, oh, I want to now modify this to make my game, and I don't understand it well enough to do that.
Yeah, it's all implicit. The code is a little messy, but basically, at one point there's a place that calculates, there's a couple distance functions. There's like sphere 1 and a rounded rectangle 1 and a rectangle 1. I'm not sure how split up they are.
Yeah, I didn't. I don't see one distance function. There's 3.
Yeah, but basically, like, if you want to compose multiple shapes, like all the shapes are composable, basically just random distance. So if you wanted to add another shape, you just have another distance function for that point, and then find the min of everything else that already previously existed.
You have to add it up for every time.
Yeah,
So right now it's rendering per pixel.
yeah. It's for every pixel it calculates the full distance function, and then calculates the gradient if it's within inside of the shape. And then does some shape and stuff.
Question. It's so this was I asked this question to Ian Bogost a few months, actually last year in a different context, and it was about authorship and programmers. And I was talking to Andy about this about a couple of weeks ago, about how so the way Journey looks, or the way Fez looks, I'm sure Phil had a very specific vision as to what he wanted to create, and he fed it to Renault, and then Renault implemented it. And the same way it kind of made its way through in Journey, where there's probably a design doc on those, I don't know how many people have played Journey, but there's this really awesome level in this game where you're basically surfing on sand that looks like glitter, and it's all beautiful shaders. It's the most beautiful glitter world thing I've ever seen. It's so amazing. But I was wondering how much of that implementation of creating those shaders is part of design, is part of an aesthetic that is owned by the programmer. And even though when you look at the credits at the end of the game, you have programmers and then you have designers, but you don't have this kind of in between shader designer.
Yeah, I mean,
credit.
well, I have a couple different things to say about that, but so with your Journey example with that game company, we were actually John Nesky had a title called Field Engineer, where actually he was kind of in between a design. Like he was kind of. I mean, there's also like an official title, technical designer. You don't see that often, but he was effectively a technical designer on Journey. So he was kind of the in between. Like Genovo would have some crazy high level idea, and he would prototype it. The other part of that is basically, as any collaborative effort, there's a lot of back and forth. So you can kind of try and do the whole thing where it's like, oh, here's the design, implement the spec, or you can do the thing. But the problem you end up with there is like the programmer will implement it, you don't understand what the design is, or a lot of it is you're actually getting a lot of feedback from the game also. So you see something in the game, play it, see it visually or whatever. You're like, no, we need to tweak these things, we need to tweak that, we need this extra feature. So yeah, it needs to be. I feel like it needs to be very collaborative. So yeah, the programmer has some impact on that stuff. The designer obviously has lots of impact on it, but like the actual results and how the game influences the programmer. I mean, I don't know if you've seen John Blow has given some talks on this. He said this is basically the way you design games. It's like I try something and play the game and see what the game is trying to say. That's actually like kind of a feedback loop thing. But you know, I feel like when game development is going well, you have.
Yeah, GDC, I think you talked about how that didn't happen.
Yeah, it did happen in Shadow Physics. It just didn't happen as nearly as much as it did.
I think in Journey they also, I don't even think the end credits in Journey don't even credit the specific jobs. I think it's just they went with the valve model where they just show them in alphabetical order, not saying what they actually did in the project. More questions? Sure, Matt has no one.
I do.
Are you
I'm purely indie, I'm a programmer, and it seems like my impression is that in AAA, a lot of it really just boils down to programmers making designers' dreams happen. And I think what's most interesting that's happening in indie is that people like you are just finding this tech that's inherently interesting and asking, how can I turn this into a game? How can I...
That's a little true. It's not entirely true. I think designers would like programmers to make their dreams happen, but in reality, it's a lot of it. You know, it's still the building tools to make the game rather than just using code for express rules. And there's a lot of reasons why I'm not doing that, especially if your game is better defined. But at the same time, it's like designers have to do, generally speaking, have to do lots of actual implementation or triple reviews. Just because systems are so complicated. I mean, I guess way back when, like, you're doing console games entirely assembly or something, where you had smaller things, which are probably like roughly equivalent to what we do now anyway. You would have basically a designer who would say, oh yeah, I want the game to do this. If you had a designer wasn't and the programmers would just implement it. But now it's more like designers say I want to do this, the programmers figure out what they like to do, implement a bunch of tools for them, they make the tools, just like generate constantly.
I guess what we're really getting at is that in indie it seems like it's the only space where you really have the opportunity to make a tech. Like Minecraft took boxes and said like, this is just inherently interesting. What can we do gameplay-wise with it? And then Terraria came and said, yeah, okay, but it doesn't really work great in 3D. Let's flip it in 2D and see if that extra perspective, well, that lack of an extra perspective, will make the gameplay more interesting. But they got to just play with this technology that you don't really see happening too much in AAA.
Yeah, you don't.
Do you find that?
Yeah, you don't. I mean, you don't really see that so much, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, a lot of it is just risk adverse. And that isn't to say like AAA just hates risk. It's just literally that when you have a $50 to $100 million project, you want to go with something that you think is going to probably be relatively successful, not go too far off. It's like you were talking about earlier. A lot of this stuff is cool. There are a lot of cool ideas out there. 90% of them are fail. 5% will ship or whatever. If 1%, one game will be Minecraft. So or Terraria. You know, there's like a limited amount of games that hit that level. So yeah, it's definitely a risk. A lot of it's just fiscal risk. But if AAA games are lower budget, you probably see something. And also the difference between there's differences between in the sense that like AAA teams are staffed up with ridiculous amounts of artists. You have just people cranking out tons and tons of art assets. So there's not really a need for procedural generation yet. I think there probably will be in the future, but at this point, like indie stuff, you can do like higher end tech stuff. It's not, it's just pixel art. You hit that wall, you just can't have a single artist or 2 or 3 artists to generate assets to drive something. So what do you do?
So in this like the relationship between like a designer and a programmer working together, I think a lot of times a designer would love to use these tools, but doesn't really know that they exist for procedural generation, and it just may not even think of them when articulating an official game design or spec or whatever. And so, I mean, are there any ways that programmers can help designers that they work with know what's available and just come up with new ideas and experiment? Is it just a matter of designers learning more about the tech? Or
yeah, I mean, it could become like a programmer can build a tech demo and then some tools.
But I mean,
yeah, back and forth.
there's got to be lots of different. I mean, there's so many different techniques out there that can be used. And, how can we help spark that creative process to find some new tech?
I mean, I don't know. You could check out like you said. For me, a lot of the inspirations come outside of the game industry. So you could look at what's going on in demos. You could look at what's going on in creative coding. You can look at SIGGRAPH papers. You can look at what's going on in web development. There's lots of interesting tech stuff going on. And even if you don't really understand it, like as a designer, I think if you watch that stuff, you can say, well, this looks kind of cool. Maybe you go over and like maybe you can do something like this. It does something like this. This is ridiculous. Or maybe like this is a great idea. Yeah, we should try it out. Or we can do something like this. It's not exactly like this.
So a lot of people say that an artist learning a program is easier than a programmer learning how to do art. So like taking that as a core, how would you like suggest ways for, as a programmer myself, like, expanding my this art repertoire, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's funny because it's like, so I'm a firm believer that anyone can learn how to program, and should. Anyone can learn how to draw, and should. But the issue is, and this happened with me, like I actually really enjoy drawing and making art, but I'm not necessarily particularly good at it. And the issue is that eventually you hit a wall where like you are okay, but you're not an expert. You're like kind of functional. But to become an expert, you have to kind of immerse yourself in practice and practice and practice. And this is back to the limited time thing. You have limited time, so you can only focus on 1 or 2 things, really. So I think that's why you don't see a lot of people who are both expert programmers and expert artists, because to actually get to expert level in either of those things, it requires a lot of dedication. But to get to like decent level, it actually isn't that bad. There was there was a series of blog posts by Chris and Brad called 2D Vector Art for Programmers or something. I forget exactly what the series was called, but it was pretty good. But it's basically teaching people how to use it in Steam and just like basic form and basic color and stuff like that. There's also a book called that you probably had recommended to me called Drawing on the Right Side of the Room, which is supposed to be like, this is how you learn how to, basic drawing techniques. If you're not an artistically inclined person, you can read the book and like follow this stuff. But a lot of it comes out of practice. Like you sketch every day and draw from life every day. You may not be the greatest artist in the world, but you will learn better at it. That's all I can say.
Well, I want to see your product of fighting name. Do you have sketches about it? Do you draw it up? No? You don't even? Okay. Well, it's typical that these don't have design documents. You have like
I have some design documents.
You have some design documents? What's
Not for the part.
Not for the part. For the sign distance field.
No.
So for the different games.
Yeah, for different
What's
games.
the tech in the different games?
They're actually not their exact related games. It's kind of interesting that when I have design documents, they're not.
Are they more tabletop games?
Yeah, they're more like tabletop stuff.
Okay.
But I have an idea for like a fast play role like a single
As a
screen
board game.
It could be a board game, it could be a video game. It works. Yeah. I have some like epic simulation procedural generators.
So the tech is the procedural generation.
Yeah, there's tech there. But I think a lot of the reason why I don't have design docs for these more tech-driven things is because it's very prototype-driven. Like I feel like the prototype is the design. Maybe that's the wrong way.
You can't really rate the dynamic feel of it.
I mean,
you can't rate that in words.
I mean, I could write a page. I could write a page about what the particle system, like how. So the particle system fighting game. The idea is basically. I know you want me to. The idea is basically you have.
You know this is going to get ripped up like this in film.
I know. I don't care.
You're
Rip
gonna
it off.
see
Slowly, wait 1 second.
Rip it off. The particle system fighting game is basically you have two characters or more characters that are made entirely out of particles and
ballpark number of thousands.
Thousands to millions.
Thousands to millions per character.
Yeah.
You're not ambitious at all.
And then, so you have different moves like fighting games. So you have just strikes that are not particles of the other character, but then because they're particles, they can be fully dynamic, so they can change state. So you can change from like solid to liquid to gas, and you have different physical properties. Gases float up, so you turn your guy to gas and fly. And then you have like temperature values, so you have certain heat values and their characters. So the idea is it'd be extremely chaotic and probably a mess.
It's like as far from a traditional like discrete fighting.
Yeah, it's
with like rectilinear hitboxes.
There actually were going to be hitboxes though.
Oh really?
Yeah.
So you are going to like still wrap.
They're going to be hitboxes, but the hitboxes are going to be vector fields, so they're like forces. They push the.
When's this coming out? 2020, 2017, 2018?
The Kickstarter is probably going to say 2016 because that's as far ahead as
I think that's a good note. So let's thank our speaker. Thanks a lot. I think Eileen's going to announce